Imagine packing a custom-built wooden boat with 12 tons of experimental weaponry, scientific gear, and trade goods.
Right, just fully loaded down.
Yeah, and you are about to sail entirely off the edge of the known map. But here is the catch. You know for an absolute fact that the world's most powerful empires have just dispatched secret military detachments with explicit orders to hunt you down.
To hunt you down, arrest you, and confiscate everything you have.
Exactly. And that wasn't a pitch for a Hollywood thriller. That was the grim geopolitical reality for the Lewis and Clark expedition in the spring of 1804. So welcome to part one of a special four-part deep dive into a historical event that has honestly been tragically stripped of its fang.
Oh, totally. It really has.
Right. I want you to take that sanitized middle school textbook version of this story. You know, the one where two guys go on a pleasant camping trip, point at a few mountains, and paddle happily to the Pacific Ocean. I want you to take that and throw it completely out the window.
Because that textbook narrative does a massive disservice to the sheer audacity of what they were attempting. I mean, the reality of 1803 was incredibly volatile.
Which is where this all starts, really.
Yeah, to understand why this expedition was even launched, you have to look at the world map at that specific moment. The United States had just finalized the Louisiana Purchase, which, on paper, doubled the landmass of the country overnight.
But it's crucial to emphasize those words, right? On paper.
Right, exactly, on paper. Because this was a massive real estate transaction negotiated in fancy rooms in Paris for a staggering amount of land that absolutely nobody involved in the transaction had ever laid eyes on. It was basically a theoretical empire.
Which is wild. Buying a house sight unseen is a bad idea. Buying half a continent sight unseen seems like an act of geopolitical madness. I mean, Thomas Jefferson basically bought a void.
But wait, let's talk about those assassins you mentioned.
Yeah, the Spanish detachments.
Right. If the land was purchased legally from France, why were there military detachments trying to hunt them down? Because the Spanish government, who controlled Mexico and the vast territories of the American Southwest, they viewed this transaction as completely illegitimate.
They didn't recognize the sale at all.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
They were absolutely furious about this sudden American expansion right up against their borders. And Spain didn't just sit in Madrid and write angry diplomatic letters to Washington.
No, they took actual action.
Exactly. The Spanish governors in the northern provinces issued secret, lethal orders to their military commandants. I mean, their explicit instructions were to intercept the American expedition by any means necessary.
Wow. By any means necessary.
Yeah. They actually sent out a frontiersman and explorer named Pedro Vial. He was leading heavily armed Comanche and Spanish troops, specifically to find Lewis and Clark.
So they literally had a target on their backs before they even pushed the boat into the water. But why did Vial fail? I mean, if the Spanish were intent on stopping them, how did this massive, slow-moving wooden boat slip by?
Honestly, it came down to the sheer, terrifying vastness of the Great Plains and, you know, a bit of historical luck.
Just the sheer size of the country.
Yeah. Vial and his forces actually set out multiple times, but the geography was so immense and the weather was so unpredictable that they either got delayed by tribal conflicts or they just simply couldn't locate the American needle in the continental haystack.
But Lewis and Clark didn't know the Spanish would fail.
Oh, not at all. They operated under the constant paranoia that heavily armed European forces were waiting around the literally next river bend.
Which totally reframes the entire why of the mission for me. I mean, they weren't just out there to collect pressed flowers and sketch prairie dogs. They were searching for the Northwest Passage.
Yeah.
This mythical, commercially viable water route to the Pacific Ocean that everyone thought existed. But beyond that, it was a race, right?
Well, you might call it a race, but I'd argue it was actually more of a high-stakes stealth mission.
Okay, stealth mission. How so?
Thomas Jefferson wasn't just worried about speed. He was terrified of triggering an international war. He needed to map, secure, and figure out how to economically exploit the trans-Mississippi West before Great Britain, who was coming down from Canada, or Spain, coming up from the south, could establish permanent forts and lock the United States out entirely.
So he's trying to plant the flag before the superpowers realize what's happening.
Exactly. He needed a complete, irrefutable catalog of the resources, the geography, and, critically, the sovereign native populations that controlled the entire region. He was sending a probe into a highly contested, almost alien world.
And to pull off a mission with that level of complexity, sending one guy with a compass and a journal just isn't going to cut it.
No, definitely not.
Jefferson needed a very specific leadership dynamic, which leads us to look closely at who he actually picked. He establishes a dual command structure. First, he selects his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis. And then Lewis turns around and asks his former military superior, William Clark, to be his co-commander. Now, I have to say, in a strict military hierarchy, a co-command sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, it usually is.
It is like having two CEOs with equal veto power trying to run a high-risk startup while actively starving and lost in the woods. That sounds like a recipe for mutiny. How on earth did they avoid destroying each other?
Well, it worked because their psychological and professional profiles were drastically different, yet, perfectly complementary.
Okay, so opposites attract.
Pretty much. If we look at the biographical data, we see two men who were almost opposites in temperament. Meriwether Lewis was 29 years old when this kicked off. He was brilliant, deeply introspective, and highly analytical.
And he had wilderness experience too, right?
Yeah, he grew up on a Virginia plantation, so he had tremendous wilderness survival skills. But Jefferson didn't just trust his frontier background. He sent Lewis to Philadelphia to be trained by the absolute elite scientists of the day.
People like Dr. Benjamin Rush.
Exactly. Dr. Rush and Caspar Wister gave him intensive crash courses in botany, anatomy, celestial navigation, and medicine.
But there is a massive catch with Lewis. Reading through the sources, he had a significant psychological shadow hanging over him.
He really did.
He suffered from severe bouts of melancholia, or what they called at the time hypochondriac affection, and he was known to self-medicate with heavy drinking. I mean, he was undeniably brilliant, but he had these deep, dark valleys in his mental health where he would just withdraw.
And physically, he was prone to bouts of malaria, too, which they called the violent ague.
Right. So he's not exactly the picture of stable health.
Which is precisely why he needed William Clark. Clark was 33, so a bit older, and importantly, he had been Lewis's commanding officer when they served together briefly in the military in 1795.
So there was already a baseline of respect there.
A deep respect, yeah. And Clark was intensely pragmatic. He was emotionally grounded. He didn't have Lewis's formal, polished scientific education from the Philadelphia elite, but he was a master of frontier warfare. He was an incredible natural cartographer and an expert riverboat man.
He's sort of the grounded older brother figure, the engineer with his boots in the mud, while Lewis is the scientist living in his head.
That dynamic is exactly what kept them alive. Lewis would spend hours wandering the shoreline cataloging new species of plants, while Clark stayed on the boat, mapping the river's curves and managing an incredibly unruly crew of frontiersmen.
But this dual command almost didn't happen, right? Due to a massive bureaucratic failure in Washington.
Yes. This is one of the most fascinating secrets of the entire expedition.
It's shocking, honestly. When Lewis promised Clark a co-command, he promised him the rank of captain. But the War Department back in Washington, the ultimate bureaucracy, flat out refused to make William Clark a captain.
They rejected it completely.
They only commissioned him as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Artillerists, which in military terms is a profound insult to a man of his experience. I am really trying to wrap my head around this. If the military found out Lewis hid this, wouldn't Lewis face court-martial himself?
Almost certainly.
So how did they keep that secret from a crew of 30 men living in incredibly close quarters?
It speaks volumes about Lewis's psychological maturity and, his absolute dedication to the mission over his own ego. Instead of accepting that hierarchy and lording his higher rank over his friend, Lewis made a highly calculated, arguably illegal decision.
He just buried the paperwork.
He hid the official paperwork entirely. He concealed this administrative slight from every single enlisted man on the expedition. He maintained a perfectly unified front.
So he just called him captain anyway.
Yep. He ensured that Clark was always addressed as captain and treated him as an absolute equal in every disciplinary decision, every journal entry, and every strategic command.
He just lied to the crew for 2.5 years.
He did, because he knew that if the enlisted men realized there was a disparity in rank, human nature would take over.
Right, they'd play favorites.
Exactly. The moment things got tough, and they got incredibly tough, the men might have tried to play the commanders against each other. Lewis's decision to swallow his pride and forge this unbreakable trust through a shared lie is arguably the foundational act that saved the expedition from dissolving.
Wow. So with that unified leadership built on a lie of equality, they had to take this rowdy group of independent frontiersmen and forge them into a disciplined military machine. Let's look at the timeline. May 14th, 1804. They officially depart from Camp River du Bois and began ascending the Missouri River.
The journey officially begins.
And they are doing this in an absolute beast of a boat. They had a custom-built, 55-foot-long keel boat that Lewis had stressed over for months back in Pittsburgh.
And the construction phase in Pittsburgh was a nightmare in itself. It was delayed constantly by an alcoholic boat builder, which caused Lewis tremendous anxiety.
I can imagine. He's on a ticking clock.
He was racing against the changing seasons, watching the water levels on the Ohio River drop dangerously low before they even got to the starting line on the Mississippi. But by the time it was finished, they had a vessel that was essentially a floating fortress.
It had an 8-foot beam, it drew 3 feet of water, and it was packed with 12 tons of cargo. We are talking scientific instruments, gunpowder stored in waterproof lead canisters, huge bales of trade goods, and medicine. Now, the natural, unchannelized Missouri River of 1804 is not the tame, dammed-up river that we know today.
Not even close. The modern Missouri River is engineered. The 1804 Missouri was an environmental nightmare for a boat of that size. The river was wild, shallow, and incredibly violent.
What made it so violent?
Well, we're talking about constantly shifting sandbars that could ground the boat in an instant. There were what they called falling-in banks, massive cliffs of mud and dirt that would spontaneously collapse under their own weight into the water.
Just falling right on top of them.
Yes, sometimes nearly crushing the smaller canoes, and worst of all were the snags.
What exactly made the snags so lethal? I mean, it sounds like just a branch in the water.
A snag isn't just a floating stick. When massive trees fell into the river from those collapsing banks, the roots would get embedded in the mud at the bottom of the river.
Oh, wow.
And the current would strip the branches, leaving massive, sharpened wooden trunks pointing downstream just beneath the surface of the muddy water. They were essentially giant wooden spears.
That is terrifying.
If a 12-ton wooden keelboat moving against the current hit a snag, it could impale the hull and sink the entire expedition in a matter of minutes. And the current they were fighting was relentlessly pushing against them at about 1 to 2 miles per hour.
I was trying to visualize the physics of moving this thing. I want you, the listener, to imagine taking a fully loaded U-Haul truck. Now imagine dragging it through a swamp with a thick hemp rope.
Yeah, that's accurate.
While walking in knee-deep mud, tripping over hidden roots. And you were doing this while being eaten alive by swarms of mosquitoes, ticks, and gnats in 100-degree, humid Midwestern summer heat.
That captures the agony perfectly. They couldn't just sail upriver because the wind rarely cooperated and the river twisted too much. So they relied on 3 brutal methods of propulsion. First was cordelling, which is the U-Haul scenario you just described.
Right.
The men would get off the boat, slog onto the shore, sink into the mud, and literally pull the 12-ton boat forward with a heavy tow line.
Just brute, human draft animal labor. And those tow lines would occasionally snap under the tension, sending the boat spinning wildly out of control downstream.
Yeah.
They'd lose hours of agonizing progress in seconds.
Precisely. The calorie burn was astronomical. The men were consuming up to 9 pounds of meat a day just to maintain their body weight.
9 pounds a day.
Yeah. And when they couldn't cordel because the banks were too thick with brush, they used poling. The men stood on the deck, jammed heavy iron-tipped poles into the riverbed, put the top of the pole against their shoulders, and physically walked from the front of the boat to the back.
Pushing the vessel forward beneath their feet.
Exactly. And finally, when the channel was deep enough and the bottom too soft for poles, 20 oarsmen would just have to row against that relentless current.
It's no wonder the morale just absolutely shattered in those first few months. I mean, these were tough, independent guys. They were used to being lone hunters or loosely affiliated traders. They were not used to being treated like draft horses, and they certainly bristled at strict U.S. military rules. So they start pushing back. They test the boundaries.
And the captains knew that if they lost control during this critical, grueling phase, the expedition would completely dissolve before they even saw the foothills of a mountain.
Right, they just mutiny and go home.
Exactly. This necessitated the implementation of ruthless, swift military justice.
The sources detail these courts-martial that the captains deployed to establish total dominance. And honestly, they read like something out of a medieval torture manual.
They are intense.
In June, Private John Collins gets drunk on guard duty, and Private Hugh Hall taps into the public whiskey keg without permission. The sentence. Collins gets 100 lashes on his bare back, and Hall gets 50.
Then you have Private Alexander Willard in July. He was caught sleeping while on night guard duty. In the military, sleeping on guard duty in hostile territory is a capital offense.
You can be executed by firing squad for that.
Yes. They didn't execute him, largely because they couldn't afford to lose the manpower, but they sentenced him to 100 lashes. And to make sure his body didn't go into fatal shock, they administered it as 25 lashes a day for 4 consecutive days.
That is just brutal.
And the tension peaks in August with Private Moses Reed.
Right. Reed actually deserts the camp. He steals military supplies, takes some knives, and makes a run for it. When they send out a posse and catch him, they sentence him to run the gauntlet 4 times.
Which is horrific.
Meaning, every single one of his crewmates had to form 2 lines and whip him with heavy wooden switches as he ran past them. And then they expelled him from the permanent party, stripping him of his status.
We really have to contextualize this because it sounds barbaric to a modern listener, but this was standard, codified United States Army practice at the time.
It was just how things were done.
Physical terror was the accepted tool for forging unit cohesion. However, if you look closely at the captain's methodology, they didn't just use terror blindly. They were very deliberate in blending this extreme violence with selective mercy.
How do you show mercy with a whip?
By not using it when it's expected. Early on, 2 privates went AWOL and were sentenced to 25 lashes. But the captains publicly remitted the punishment. They canceled it, citing the men's prior good conduct.
So they're playing good cop, bad cop, but on a systemic level.
Exactly. They are demonstrating absolute lethal authority, but also showing that they are rational, observant judges who reward loyalty. By the time they finished the first summer, this psychological manipulation worked.
They broke them in.
They did. They had created a unified, terrified, but highly effective and fiercely loyal military unit. After August 1804, the major disciplinary issues almost entirely vanished.
Because they knew exactly where the line was. So the brutal discipline saved the men from turning on each other. But as we know, military discipline cannot save you from biology.
Unfortunately not.
As they're grinding up the river, the frontier claims its first life. And looking at the sheer danger of this 2-year journey, it is a statistical miracle that it was its only life.
The fact that only 1 man died is astonishing. But the loss they suffered early on was profound and deeply felt by the entire crew.
The timeline hits August 19, 1804. They are near modern-day Sioux City, Iowa. Sergeant Charles Floyd, who was this 22-year-old kid from Kentucky, falls violently ill. And Floyd wasn't just any soldier. He was one of the first 3 permanent enlisted men, a trusted non-commissioned officer, and he was keeping this meticulous journal about the soil quality and the landscape.
He was a vital part of the team.
And suddenly, he is struck down by what the captains diagnosed as bilious colic.
The symptoms Floyd experienced, as detailed in the expedition's journals, were agonizing. He suffered from severe abdominal pain, unrelenting vomiting, and a very rapid, terrifying physical decline.
I have to pause here. We just established earlier that Meriwether Lewis had the absolute best medical training available in the United States. He studied under Dr. Benjamin Rush. He had a massive, expensive medicine chest filled with the best drugs money could buy. Why couldn't he save a 22-year-old kid?
Because the best medical training in 1804 was fundamentally flawed and often lethal in its own right.
What do you mean?
Modern medical analysis of the journals makes it quite clear. Floyd didn't have bilious colic. He was suffering from acute appendicitis. And on August 20th, that inflamed appendix ruptured, leading to peritonitis, a massive, fatal abdominal infection.
Oh, man.
In 1804, before the advent of antibiotics or safe surgical appendectomies, a ruptured appendix was an absolute death sentence, no matter who your doctor was.
But Lewis had all those medicines. Did he try to use them?
Here is the tragic, ironic mechanism of 18th and 19th century medicine. If Lewis had utilized his elite medical training, if he had used the standard treatments he was taught by Dr. Rush, he would have administered what were known as Rush's thunderclappers.
Thunderclappers? That sounds terrifying. What were they?
They were highly potent purgative pills made of calomel, which is a mercury compound, and jalap, a powerful root extract. They were essentially incredibly violent laxatives meant to purge the body of bad humors.
Oh, no.
Yes. If Lewis had given those heavy laxatives to Floyd, the resulting violent intestinal contractions would have caused the inflamed appendix to rupture even faster and spread the infection through the abdominal cavity much quicker.
So the medicine would have killed him.
The accepted medical science of the day would have actually killed Floyd sooner. There was literally nothing they could do but watch him fade.
The sources describe his final hours. And it's this incredibly touching, purely human scene amidst all this military rigidity. You have Captain Clark and his enslaved valet, York, staying up through the night, trying to nurse this kid, doing everything they can to keep him comfortable.
Just providing comfort care, really.
And on August 20th, Floyd speaks his last words to Clark. He says, I am going away, and I want you to write me a letter.
It strips away the grandeur of the imperial mission and reminds you of the sheer human cost. He was just a young man far from home.
They buried him with full military honors on a high bluff overlooking the river, with a simple cedar post marking the grave. But the story of Charles Floyd doesn't end there. The legacy of his physical remains is one of the most bizarre side stories I've ever read.
It really is. The landscape of the Missouri River is completely dynamic. It constantly consumes itself. By 1857, decades after the expedition had passed into history, the river had severely eroded the base of that specific bluff.
The actual hill was disappearing.
Exactly. The cliff face actually collapsed, and a massive portion of Floyd's grave slid right down the hill toward the rushing water.
His bones literally falling out of the cliff.
Yes. Concerned citizens from the newly formed settlement of Sioux City had to scramble up the collapsing mud bank, recover his remains, including his skull, and rebury them further back from the edge in a walnut coffin.
At least they saved them.
But then the grave was lost again because local livestock trampled the area, grazing over the soil, and souvenir hunters chipped away pieces of the wooden marker.
Cows just grazing over the first American casualty of the West. That is incredibly undignified.
It wasn't until 1894, when Floyd's original expedition journal was finally discovered in a historical archive, that national interest spiked again. They finally relocated the bones, placed them in protective earthenware urns, and today there is a massive 100-foot-tall sandstone obelisk marking his final resting place.
A 100-foot obelisk for a 22-year-old kid who just wanted a letter written home. But the crew had absolutely no time to mourn him, because just a month later, they sailed right into a geopolitical trap. And this was a trap set by the most powerful native nation on the upper Missouri.
This encounter is where Thomas Jefferson's grand theoretical plans from Paris collide violently with the complex economic reality on the ground.
Let's clear up a massive misconception right now. When you hear about the uncharted West or the frontier, it's incredibly easy to picture an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered by white explorers.
The empty continent myth.
Right. But it wasn't empty. It was a densely populated, incredibly complex web of sovereign native nations with their own highly defined borders, intricate economies, and shifting alliances.
And understanding that specific economic web is crucial to understanding what happens next. President Jefferson's goal was to establish a direct American trade hegemony. He wanted American boats sailing freely up the river to trade manufactured goods directly with all native tribes.
But this direct trade route posed an existential economic threat to the Teton Sioux, or the Lakota people.
Because the Lakotas were the gatekeepers of the river.
Exactly. They were the absolute masters of the regional economy. The Lakotas controlled the geographical bottleneck of the upper Missouri. They operated a highly lucrative trade monopoly.
How did that monopoly work, practically?
Well, once a year, at a massive gathering called the Dakota Rendezvous, the Lakotas would acquire European manufactured goods like muskets, iron kettles, and metal tools from British and French traders coming down from the north and east. Then the Lakotas would take those goods and trade them at a massive premium to the agricultural tribes living further up the Missouri River, like the Arikaras and the Mandans.
In exchange for surplus corn, beans, and buffalo robes.
So they were the ultimate middlemen. They bought wholesale from the British and sold retail to the Mandans. And here comes Lewis and Clark sailing a massive boat packed with guns and kettles, essentially telling the upriver tribes, hey, we're going to cut out the middlemen. We'll trade with you directly from now on.
That would utterly destroy the Lakota economy.
Right.
If you look at it objectively, when the Lakotas eventually stopped the Lewis and Clark expedition, they were not acting as random bandits or river pirates. This was a highly rational, defensive act of statecraft. It was border control.
They're just enforcing the rules of their territory.
Exactly. British and French traders had always paid heavy tariffs to the Lakota to pass through their waters. The Lakotas were simply enforcing a tariff to protect their national economy, and the Americans, acting out of arrogance and a belief in their own sovereignty, refused to pay it.
Which brings us to the flashpoint, September 25, 1804. The Bad River Standoff. I want to set the scene here because it plays out like a tense movie thriller where nobody speaks the same language.
It's incredibly intense.
The expedition meets with the Lakota chiefs on the riverbank. The captains offer some gifts to secure passage, but the gifts are completely inadequate. They offer some tobacco and a few medals.
Which completely disrespects the Lakota's status as the dominant power.
Totally. One of the chiefs, a prominent leader known as the Partisan, is insulted. He decides he's going to leverage this situation to boost his own political standing within his tribe. So, he fakes being deeply intoxicated. He staggers right into William Clark on the riverbank, bumps him hard, and flat out says through an interpreter, "You cannot pass."
The physical intimidation was highly deliberate. It was a physical test of American sovereignty and resolve.
And it escalates instantly. The partisan signals his men, and heavily armed Lakota warriors rush forward. They seize the massive hemp cable tying the American boat to the shore. William Clark, who we established as a seasoned combat veteran, doesn't try to negotiate further. He draws his sword.
Things are spiraling out of control.
Out on the river, on the keel boat, Meriwether Lewis sees the warriors grabbing the cable. He orders the men to take the heavy swivel guns. These are basically small cannons mounted on the rails, loaded with musket balls and scrap metal, and aim them directly at the massive crowd of men, women, and children on the shore. They light the matches for the cannons. The entire expedition is literally seconds away from a bloodbath.
It is the absolute closest the expedition came to total annihilation. Let's be clear about the tactical reality. If Lewis had fired that swivel gun, they might have killed a dozen Lakota in the first blast. But the sheer numbers of the Lakota warriors would have eventually overwhelmed the boat and wiped out every single American on it.
So how does this bomb get diffused?
It is diffused not by American military might or intimidation, but by native diplomacy. Chief Black Buffalo, another prominent Lakota leader who had a broader strategic vision, recognizes that a massacre of these Americans would disrupt the larger peace and trade networks of his own country.
He doesn't want a war that day.
Right. He steps in, physically takes hold of the boat's cable, orders his warriors to back down, and de-escalates the situation.
He literally pulls the fuse out of the bomb. A firefight is avoided, and they are allowed to sail on, but the psychological tension remains. Clark is furious at being challenged. He leaves that encounter with a really deep, festering bitterness. He writes in his journal calling the Lakota the vilest miscreants of the savage race.
He just could not see them as rival diplomats protecting their borders. He only saw them as obstacles to American destiny.
It highlights a massive cultural and diplomatic failure on the part of the captains. They failed to understand the world they were moving through.
But to give a full picture, this tense, almost fatal encounter contrasts sharply with two other diplomatic meetings they had around the same time, which really shows the incredible complexity and variety of native relations they experienced.
Right, it wasn't all hostility and drawn swords. Just a month prior, in August, they met with the Yankton Sioux. And it was a completely different vibe. It was a peaceful, highly formal council. And there's this incredible moment. During diplomatic meetings, a baby boy is born in the Yankton camp. Meriwether Lewis takes an American flag, walks over, wraps the newborn infant in it, and dramatically declares him an American citizen.
And that diplomatic gesture actually had lasting historical reverberations. That baby grew up to be struck by the Ree, who became one of the most famous, influential, and peaceful Yankton chiefs of the late 19th century.
It's a remarkable thread of history. And then, as they move further north in October, they reach the villages of the Arikaras. And here we see a totally different cultural dynamic centered almost entirely around William Clark's enslaved valet, York.
The presence of York is one of the most fascinating cultural dimensions of the entire journey. The Arikaras, and later the Mandans, were part of a massive trade network. They had encountered white French and British traders for decades, but they had absolutely never seen a black man.
They were deeply, deeply fascinated by him. The sources note that they viewed York as big medicine, meaning they believed he was a spiritual entity of immense power. They thought his skin color was a manifestation of spiritual strength.
And York, recognizing his highly unique position and perhaps enjoying the sudden shift in social power dynamic away from his enslaved status, humored them. He played into the mythos.
He really leaned into it.
He did. He would perform incredible feats of strength, lifting heavy objects that no one else could, and wrestling the native men. He even told them a tall tale that he had once been a wild animal that Captain Clark had managed to capture and tame.
There is that one detail from the sources that is just astonishing to read. The Mandan chief, LeBorn, was highly skeptical of the whole thing. He thought York was just a white man painted with charcoal as some kind of trick. So the chief literally walks up, tries to vigorously rub York's skin, and spits on his own finger to see if the paint will wash off.
He couldn't believe it was real.
He only believes it when York uncovers his head and shows him his natural hair.
It's a stark reminder of the intense isolation of these communities from global demographics. But functionally, York became a massive diplomatic asset. His presence broke the ice, fostered intense curiosity rather than hostility, and built incredibly warm relations during a phase of the journey where the Americans desperately needed local allies.
Because they needed those allies to survive what was looming on the horizon. October was coming to an end. The beautiful, crisp autumn on the Great Plains was over. Winter was coming, and the Missouri River was about to freeze, completely solid, trapping them. It was unavoidable. The geopolitical chess game was about to be put on hold by a much deadlier enemy, the Dakota winter. If they didn't figure out how to survive the freeze, the Spanish wouldn't need to hunt them down at all.
This is where the expedition shifts from exploration and mapping to a brutal, daily, hour-by-hour struggle against the elements.
In late October, they find themselves near the Knife River in present-day North Dakota, surrounded by the massive, bustling Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations. They know the river's icing up, so they decide to build their winter headquarters, Fort Mandan.
The architecture of Fort Mandan was designed entirely around defense and heat retention, though it failed miserably at the latter.
They were freezing.
Yeah, they chopped down massive cottonwood trees and built 2 rows of inward-facing cabins. They banked the outside walls with thick dirt for insulation and enclosed the whole complex in an 18-foot-high defensive stockade with a swivel gun mounted at the front gate.
But even with thick logs and dirt-banked walls, the weather data from the captives' journals is just horrifying. Let's look at the temperatures they faithfully recorded. It dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, it was so brutally cold that the ink literally froze inside their pens while they were sitting inside the cabins trying to write in their journals.
The environmental shock was severe, especially for men from Virginia and Kentucky. The native Mandan and Hidatsa families lived quite comfortably. They had spent centuries perfecting massive, incredibly well-insulated earth lodges that retained heat beautifully.
But the Americans didn't have that.
No, the Americans were trapped in poorly insulated cottonwood cabins that required a roaring fire 24 hours a day just to keep the men from freezing to death in their sleep.
Men were getting horrific frostbite, just stepping outside the gates to try and hunt for meat. And that brings up the biggest logistical problem. They are burning massive amounts of calories just shivering to stay alive. The game has either migrated or is too hard to hunt in deep snow. They are facing absolute starvation.
And they had a strict administrative rule set by Lewis. They could not dip into their main supply of trade goods, the premium glass beads, the fine fabrics, the metal kettles, because those were strictly reserved for the western leg of the journey.
They were saving their money, basically.
They needed those to buy horses later.
So how do you buy food when you were forbidden from spending your money?
You manufacture a completely new currency. And this is where the pragmatic, blue-collar genius of the expedition truly shines. They created a blacksmith trade economy out of thin air.
This is one of my favorite details of the whole expedition. You have Private John Shields, who's the oldest guy on the crew and a master blacksmith, along with William Bratton and Alexander Willard. They set up a blacksmith forge right there in the freezing courtyard of the fort.
Right out in the elements.
I want you to picture the physics of this.
Yeah.
It is 40 degrees below zero, the wind is howling, and these guys are out there pumping a leather bellows, burning locally made wood charcoal to get a fire up to 2,000 degrees, and melting down absolute junk. Old rusty kettles, scrap sheet iron, broken metal hinges.
And to the Mandans and Hidatsas, this manipulation of metal was extraordinary. They understood metal, they bought it from the British, but they had never seen it manipulated. They viewed the blacksmith's ability to heat, bend, and shape iron out of nothing as a powerful, almost spiritual form of magic.
It was pure alchemy. So Shields and his team start churning out custom goods to meet local demand. They make ironhide scrapers, metal punches, and these highly prized, customized war axes and tomahawks.
They even set up a repair shop.
Right, fixing the metal hoes and muskets that the native people had previously bought from the British but couldn't fix themselves.
And the economics of it were perfect. In exchange for this metalwork, the Mandan and Hidatsa women would bring daily shipments of surplus corn, dried beans, and squash right to the gates of Fort Mandan.
A few pieces of hot scrap metal literally saved the Corps of Discovery from starving to death in the snow.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply reliant the expedition was on native agriculture and the existing economy. The myth is that they survived by conquering the wilderness with their rifles.
But they didn't.
No, the reality is they survived by integrating themselves into the complex, established local economy of the Mandan people.
Okay, so they are surviving the winter, trading custom axes for corn. But Lewis and Clark aren't just trying to survive the freeze, they are desperately planning for the spring thaw. They know from talking to the local tribes that the massive, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains are looming ahead of them. And as any good riverman knows, canoes cannot climb mountains.
No, they cannot. They knew they would hit a continental divide and have to abandon the boats entirely. And to cross the Rockies carrying all their gear, they needed horses. Lots of them.
And the only people who had horses up in those high mountain passes were the Shoshone Nation. So they need to find the Shoshone, but more importantly, they need someone who can actually speak to them to negotiate the trade. Which brings us to a pivotal moment in February 1805.
This is where we encounter perhaps the most heavily mythologized figure of the entire expedition and perhaps in American history.
Let's start with how she actually gets on the payroll, because it's not what most people think. The captains go out into the native villages and hire this guy named Toussaint Charbonneau. He's a French-Canadian fur trapper living among the Hidatsas. But here's the thing. Charbonneau was kind of a dud.
He really was. He was notoriously clumsy and easily panicked.
He wasn't the prize they were after. The only reason they hired him was because of his teenage wife.
Enter Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone by birth. Around the year 1800, when she was just a child, her camp near the Three Forks of the Missouri had been attacked by a Hidatsa war party.
So she was taken away from her home.
She was taken captive, marched hundreds of miles east, and subsequently sold to or won in a gambling match by Charbonneau.
She is roughly 16 years old when Lewis and Clark meet her in November 1804. Think about that. She is a captive, she is a teenager, and she is 6 months pregnant.
And yet, despite her incredibly marginalized status, she holds the vital linguistic key to the entire western half of the continent for the Americans.
The reality of her life in that fort is so intense. On February 11th, 1805, inside this freezing, cramped, smoky cabin at Fort Mandan, she goes into labor. Meriwether Lewis, who is acting as the primary doctor, is observing this, and he writes in his journal that her labor is exceptionally tedious and the pain is violent. She's struggling to deliver the baby.
And this leads to one of the most bizarre medical interventions of the trip. Lewis's formal medical training is failing again, but another French-Canadian interpreter there, René Jussom, suggests a local tribal remedy.
He says, give her a rattlesnake rattle. Just a crushed-up rattlesnake tail mixed with water. And Lewis, who has been obsessively collecting biological specimens all year, actually has a rattlesnake rattle sitting in his scientific box.
It's just wild timing.
He breaks off 2 rings of the rattle, crushes it up into a powder, mixes it with some water, and gives it to her. And the sources say that within 10 minutes of drinking this snake rattle water, she gives birth to a healthy baby boy.
We don't know the pharmacological mechanism of why that worked, or if it was just a coincidence of timing, but the result was Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, or as William Clark affectionately nicknamed him, Pomp, or Pompey.
Pomp.
Clark grew so fond of this child over the journey that years later, he actually financed the boy's education in St. Louis.
But let's pause here because we really need to break down a massive historical myth about Sacagawea. If you ask anyone on the street, they will say Sacagawea was the fearless guide who stood at the front of the boat and pointed the way to the Pacific Ocean.
That is entirely inaccurate. She was not a guide in the sense of navigating uncharted terrain. She recognized a few geographical landmarks when they finally reached her homeland, but her true value, the reason she was absolutely essential to their survival, was twofold. First, she was the anchor of an absurdly complex translation chain.
Oh, this translation chain is hilarious and exhausting just to think about. Okay, imagine they finally meet the Shoshone in the mountains. They desperately want to buy a horse. How does Lewis actually say, I will give you an axe for that horse? Walk us through this game of telephone.
The mechanics of the communication were incredibly convoluted. The Shoshone chief would speak in the Shoshone language to Sacagawea.
Right.
Sacagawea, having lived with her captors, would translate the Shoshone into the Hidatsa language and speak it to her husband, Charbonneau.
Who doesn't speak English?
Right. Charbonneau did not speak English, so he would translate the Hidatsa into French. He would speak French to Private Labiche or Private Lepage, who were the bilingual soldiers from the St. Louis area.
And finally,
Labiche would translate the French into English for Lewis and Clark.
Shoshone to Hidatsa to French to English, just to negotiate the price of a horse. The patience required for that, trying to convey nuanced concepts of diplomacy or trade through 5 languages, is staggering.
It was highly inefficient, but it was the only way to communicate. However, her second major role, which is often completely overlooked, was acting as a diplomatic shield.
Explain the mechanics of that, because it's brilliant.
Think about what a heavily armed military unit looks like coming up the river. To any sovereign native nation, a group of 30 strange, unwashed men carrying muskets and cannons looks exactly like a war party.
It's basically an invasion force.
It invites a preemptive attack. But native war parties never traveled with young women, and they certainly never traveled with a teenage mother carrying a newborn baby in a cradleboard. Sacagawea's sheer presence in the boat signaled absolute, undeniable peace. She was quite literally their passport through hostile territory.
Just her sitting in the canoe with baby Pomp stopped arrows from flying. It's amazing.
Yeah.
With their teenage interpreter, her unpredictable husband, and a newborn baby in tow, the ice on the river finally starts to crack and break up. Spring has arrived on the plains. The moment of truth is here. It is April 1805, and this brings us to the operational climax of their time at Fort Mandan.
Everything they've worked for, suffered for, and planned over the past year is about to be tested. The expedition must cleave itself in two.
The timeline hits April 7, 1805. The expedition has reached the very edge of the known map, that massive 55-foot keelboat we talked about, the one they dragged through the mud with tow lines. It is far too heavy and draws way too much water to go any further up the shallow, rocky, narrowing parts of the Missouri River, so they have to send it back downriver to St. Louis.
And the man they trust with this critical, high-stakes task is Corporal Richard Worthington. He commands the return party, and we cannot understate the value of the physical cargo loaded onto that boat.
It is referred to as the cargo of discovery. This is the payload for President Jefferson. What exactly are they sending back after a year of suffering?
It is the cumulative, tangible result of a year of grueling scientific and geographic labor. They loaded heavy wooden crates filled with mineral samples, detailed soil profiles from across the plains, and hundreds of carefully dried plant specimens.
It was a treasure trove of data.
Crucially, they packed William Clark's painstakingly drawn maps of the river system, Lewis's highly detailed diplomatic reports on all the tribes they met, and the daily journals kept by the men.
It's all the proof that they actually did the work and didn't just desert. But they didn't just send dead plants and paper, they sent live animals. Which I find so funny, just the sheer logistical absurdity of it. Imagine Corporal Worthington trying to keep a boat full of wild animals alive for a 1,600-mile river journey back to the president.
It was quite the menagerie. They sent 4 live magpies, a sharp-tailed grouse, and most famously, a live prairie dog.
And the mechanics of how they caught that prairie dog. The sources say they couldn't dig it out of its massive burrow system, so they literally just carried buckets from the river and poured gallons and gallons of water down its burrow until it was forced to flush out to avoid drowning.
They literally flooded it out.
Yeah, and they grabbed it,
Yeah.
and they boxed it up and shipped it to Thomas Jefferson.
And remarkably, Jefferson eventually received it alive in Washington, which is a miracle of 19th century logistics in itself.
It really is. So at the exact same moment on April 7th that Corporal Worthington turns that heavy keelboat east toward civilization, warm beds, and safety, the permanent party turns their bows west.
The contrast between the two fleets is stark. The return party is in a massive, fortified ship heading to safety. The permanent party is now reduced to a tiny, highly vulnerable fleet.
It's just 33 souls. They are packed into 6 small, hollowed-out cottonwood dugout canoes and 2 slightly larger pirogues. That's it. That is their entire defense against the Rocky Mountains. Let's look at this core group. Captain Lewis, Captain Clark, 26 enlisted soldiers, York, the civilian hunter George Drouillard, who is essentially keeping them alive with his rifle, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, Baby Pomp, and we can't forget Seaman.
Meriwether Lewis's massive Newfoundland dog.
Yes, a 150-pound dog sitting in a dugout canoe. This tiny, eclectic group turns west. And Meriwether Lewis sits down in his canoe, pulls out his journal, and writes this incredibly poignant entry for April 7th.
It is one of the most famous and revealing passages in the history of American exploration. He reflects on how this mission had been his darling project for the last 10 years of his life. And as he looks at his little fleet of canoes, he actually compares them to the majestic fleets of Christopher Columbus or Captain James Cook.
He writes that even though their boats are small, they looked at them with as much pleasure and anxiety as those famous explorers ever did. He knew exactly what they were facing. He writes that they were about to penetrate a country 2,000 miles wide where the foot of civilized man had never trodden. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine.
For experiment yet to determine. It perfectly captures the Enlightenment mindset of the era mixed with the absolute terror of the unknown. They are leaving the map completely.
As that massive keelboat floated back east, carrying the only proof that these men were even alive, those 33 remaining souls turned their tiny canoes toward the Rockies.
Hmm.
I want you to think about how fragile history really is. We just spent this entire time talking about the collapsing riverbanks, the deadly underwater snags, and the sheer violence of the Missouri River.
Hmm.
What if, on its way back to St. Louis, Corporal Worthington's heavy keelboat had struck a hidden tree underwater, split open, and sunk into the mud?
The historical implications of that one hypothetical snag are staggering. If that boat sinks, all of Clark's meticulously drawn maps are gone. All of Lewis's scientific catalogs, the journals, the diplomatic reports detailing the native nations vanished into the Missouri River.
There would be absolutely no proof of what the expedition had accomplished in their first year, no proof they survived the winter. And when Lewis and Clark disappeared into the western mountains for the next year and a half with absolutely no communication, the United States government wouldn't have known they were alive. They might have completely written off the Corps of Discovery as a total tragic failure.
It would have altered the timeline of American Western expansion entirely. Thomas Jefferson might have faced immense political backlash for wasting money on a suicide mission, and the American claims to the Pacific Northwest could have easily fallen to the British, who were aggressively moving down from Canada.
One sunken boat could have changed the entire shape of the modern map. The borders you look at on your phone today might look very different. Keep that in mind the next time you think history is a straight, inevitable line. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. You won't want to miss part 2 of this 4-part exploration, where our tiny fleet and their dugout canoes finally meets the apex predator of the plains, the grizzly bear, and slams headfirst into the brutal, freezing reality of the Rocky Mountains. We'll see you then.